singing, leading in prayers, and other things as we go through these unusual services via this digital method. I know it's difficult to, in particular, lead singing with no one in the room to assist, but he did a great job. He did an especially good job considering I suggested to him just before he got up to lead that there are several melodies to Amazing Grace, including Amazing Grace to the tune of Gilligan's Island. And in fact, I think I sang a few bars of that song, and he told me immediately to stop. And I had a flash right when he began to lead that maybe he would go into the Gilligan's Island melody, but he didn't. He did good. But I appreciate all those who have a part in making this come together for all of our benefits as we move forward through this pandemic. Every book in a word. And just a few services ago, we were in the book of Deuteronomy, and the potential that was there in the book of Deuteronomy. That transition from what was in the future to what was about to be right at their doorstep. And then the book of Joshua. It was no longer potential, but now it was there. They had the land. They were possessing the land. They crossed over Jordan. They placed those 12 stones in the way, and then they went over to Jordan. They fought their battles. They won their battles, and everything seemed to be coming together. And then we get to the book of Judges. And the only word that really is fitting for the book of Judges is the word failure. The book of Judges is riddled with the failures of God's people. All of the hope, all of the potential that existed in the book of Deuteronomy, that existed in the book of Joshua, all of that potential very quickly dissipates as the nation of Israel fails to live up to God's expectations for them in the land of promise. Failure. I tried to come up with a different word, but every word led back to that one idea. The book of Judges is really a book of failure. As we did with the book of Joshua, I'll give you the three overarching sections here. And these are not the marching points that we will use, but this is the bird's eye view of the book of Judges. Chapters 1 and 2 can be termed the explanation. How did we get to this point? Well, chapters 1 and 2 catch us up. Chapters 3 through 16, that's the exposition. That's where all of the action takes place that really the book of Judges is centered on. And then chapters 17 through 21 gives us some illustrations. Some specific events that illustrate just how far off the nation of Israel slid during this time period. So explanation, exposition, and illustration. But we're going to talk about failure tonight. And really each step of the way through the book of Judges is about failure. But where did it begin? Well, it began with a failure to separate. A failure to separate. Everything else that happens in the nation of Israel's history from this point forward begins there. Look at the marching points in chapter 1. Verse 21, it says, "And the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem unto this day." If you underline that, we're going to notice in those illustrations at the end of the book just how wicked Benjamin had become. Is it any coincidence that the tribe of Benjamin becomes wicked when they have in their midst the wicked people they were supposed to drive out? They didn't drive out the inhabitants in Benjamin. Verse 21 of chapter 1. Verse 25, "And when he showed them the entrance to the city," this is the house of Joseph, "they smote the city with the edge of the sword, but they let go the man and all his family." And the man went into the land of the Hittites, built a city, called the name thereof Luz, which is the name unto this day. They didn't wipe everybody out like God said either. Verse 27, neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean. So Manasseh didn't either. Verse 29, neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer. Verse 30, neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron and the inhabitants of Nahalal. Verse 31, neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko. On and on we go. Verse 33, neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants either. Notice, God said, I want you to completely drive out the inhabitants. I want you to push them out of the land. I want you to get them out of there so that they will not leave behind any wicked influence. And they failed to do it. Tribe after tribe after tribe failed to make the separation. And when they failed to make the separation, it was only a matter of time before they were corrupted by the influences of the people around them. And that's exactly what happened, as we will see. Dear friends, I hope you understand that we must separate ourselves. We must separate ourselves. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17 and 18, Paul writes, wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing. That's sort of a summative quote from the Old Testament. Start to finish, the Old Testament underscored the need to separate. And Paul says, God has always said, come out from among them, be separate, don't touch things that are unclean, and I will receive you, be a father unto you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. Separate. And yet time and time again, we find ourselves in the very same situation that the nation of Israel did. We fail to separate. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, just a few verses before what we just read, verse 14 reminds us that we need to not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Paul says, I recognize that we must interact with unbelievers. You good folks go to work. When you get back to work, you're surrounded by people maybe who have no faith or their faith is not according to biblical directive. And you're surrounded by people who don't live as they ought, who don't speak as they ought, who don't behave as they ought. But we don't need to yoke ourselves to those folks. We need to separate ourselves to whatever degree we can and avoid that influence. But so often we don't do that. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, Paul reminds us that if we want to be pure, if we want to be holy, we must focus our minds on those things. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. You see, what we focus on, what we take in, what we surround ourselves by eventually becomes who we are. And the nation of Israel is a prime example that when we fail to separate, it's just a matter of time before the influence of the world rubs off on us, and did for them. So failure to separate, number one. But number two, failure to impart. Failure to impart. Go to Judges chapter 2 and we'll see the second biggest problem with the nation of Israel. Maybe if they were surrounded by all of this wickedness, maybe they could hunker down their families and they could teach their families the ways of God and they could suppress those negative influences. Well, they didn't do that. In Judges chapter 2, pick up in verse 6, it says, when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man unto his inheritance to possess the land. And verse 7 says, the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that He did for Israel. And that sounds wonderful if you just look at it in those terms. They served God the entire time that Joshua lived, the entire time of those elders that outlived Joshua. But then verse 8, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. In verse 9, they buried him. And then in verse 10, and also all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which He had done for Israel. It took one generation. Now look what happened, verse 11. And the children of Israel in the second generation, the first generation served God, but it only took one generation for the children of Israel to do evil in the sight of the Lord, verse 11, and to serve Balaam, false gods. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods, of the gods of the people that were round about them, and bowed themselves unto them, and provoked the Lord to anger. Where did they find these idols to worship? In the people they didn't drive out. Because they weren't separate. And because they didn't impart to the next generation the principles and the understanding of God that they should have, then the second generation was led away by those nations they failed to drive out. I have some questions about this. What happened to Deuteronomy 6? You know, these words which I give you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them unto your children when you sit down, when you rise up, when you go by the way. You'll put them on the posts of your doors. You'll have them as frontlets between your eyelids. Remember that? He said, I want you to teach these things diligently unto your children. Did they do that? I don't see how. They could have done that and still had a generation that arose that knew not God and knew not the works that He had done. What about Deuteronomy chapter 6? But what about the memorial of Joshua chapter 4? That they cross over the land, the river Jordan, and God says, I want a man from each tribe to take a stone, and I want you to stack up those stones for a memorial. And I want you to go to Joshua chapter 4. I want to refresh our minds of what we noticed just one sermon ago relative to this. Verse 6. That this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in the time to come, saying, What mean you by these stones? Then you shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over Jordan, the waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. If they had done their due diligence relative to this heap of stones, then their children would have known that God delivered them into the land of promise. What about Joshua chapter 4? What about Deuteronomy chapter 6? Or for that matter, what about Exodus chapter 12? Where God instituted the Passover just before He took every firstborn in the land of Egypt. He instituted for the nation of Israel the Passover. And I want you to listen to these words in verse 26. And it shall come to pass when your children shall say unto you, What mean you this by this service? Then you shall say, It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when He smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. They must have forgotten to tell that story every Passover feast. Every time they looked at that heap of stones, they must have forgotten to remind them of the story of God taking them over the Jordan River. Every time they sat down to eat, they must have forgotten to tell their children about the statutes of God. There's no other explanation for one generation being faithful to God and the very next generation rising up and serving idols. They did not do what God instructed them to do, to impart to His people the knowledge of God. It goes without saying, doesn't it, that we must impart the faith to our children. Paul commends Timothy and Lois, his grandmother, and his mother Eunice for doing just that. And wouldn't it be great if Paul were here today and he could commend each of us for the same thing? The faith that is in you is in your child and your grandchild. You know, and as I was preparing this sermon, and as you're looking at the screen this evening, notice I said we must impart the faith to our children. You know what I almost put? I almost put we must impart our faith to our children, but that's not really accurate, is it? Our children don't need our faith. They need the faith. And they need to make the faith their faith, just as the faith should be ours. Maybe one of the mistakes that we make as parents is to try to give our children our faith instead of the faith. But we must impart to our children. Failure to separate and the failure to impart are the two foundational failures that led to every other failure in the book of Judges. And as we look around at our communities, at our families, at our churches, at our country, at all of the situations we find ourselves in, we need to recognize that the same is true for us. Every other failure can be traced back to a failure to separate and a failure to impart. But number 3, not only failure to separate, failure to impart, but failure to learn. Go to Judges chapter 3 this evening and let's notice the pattern that begins there. And I've underlined this in my Bible and I've written out beside it, this is the key, because this is the key to the book of Judges. And if you've ever studied the book of Judges, you're familiar with this. Verse 7, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served Baalim in the groves." That's Judges 3:7. 3:8 says, "Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and He sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, the king of Mesopotamia. And the children of Israel," it says, as you continue in verse 8, "served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. So the first step, they sinned. The second step, God punished them, sent them into captivity. The third step, verse 9, "And when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord," they repented. "Then the Lord," number 4, "raised up a deliverer." God delivered them with a judge to the children of Israel, who delivered them, even Othniel the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. So let's look at the process that exists every time that the nation of Israel sins. They sin, they suffer, they repent, and they bring their supplications to God, and God delivers them. He provides salvation from their captivity. And it happens over and over and over again. 6 times, specifically, it's mentioned in the book of Judges, this process of sin, suffering, supplication, salvation, over and over again. That's the process. And you ask, well, why didn't the nation of Israel learn? Well, that's a great question. You see, what they needed to do was break the process. They needed to break the cycle. But you can look at our lives and you can see how difficult it is for some people to break the cycle of sin. We must break the cycle. What is the popular definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But the nation of Israel, time and time again, left God. And each time they expected things to work out well. Each time they expected to be blessed for their idolatry, to be blessed for their sin. And each time they were punished. And each time they were delivered when they repented, and then each time they turned again. Dear friends, at some point we have to break the cycle. There might be somebody out within the sound of my voice this evening who finds themselves seemingly trapped in the cycle of sin. But thanks be to God that you can put that to rest. You can put the old man of sin to death. Romans 6:6 talks about that. Ephesians 4:22. All of these passages, Colossians chapter 3 and verse 9, the old man of sin can be put in a grave, and with it that tendency to revert back time and time again. We've got to break the cycle. We've got to make the decision that our cycle of sin stops here. Failure to learn. Failure to impart. Failure to separate. But finally this evening there is one other failure. You see, because what you see is this failure to separate, which led to which was compounded by a failure to impart, which led to this failure to learn, ultimately led to a failure to serve God in their daily lives. The nation of Israel looked nothing like God expected them to look, like God demanded them to look. Their lives looked nothing like God demanded they look when they entered into the Promised Land. They became so drastically different from what God demanded them to be and expected them to be, and it took such a short time because they failed to impart, they failed to separate, they failed to learn. And again, if we go to the end of the book of Judges, we go through the book of Judges, we can see some examples. Go to chapter 6 with the well-known judge Gideon. Now, we don't have time this evening to look at every judge. And so I've chosen just a few here and then one of the illustrations that you see at the end of the book. In Judges chapter 6, notice how Gideon begins, verse 11. The Midianites have overtaken the nation of Israel. And in verse 11, there came an angel of the Lord, and he sat under an oak, which is in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite. And his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. When we first are introduced to Gideon, in what condition is he? Fear, cowardice, hunkering down, threshing wheat in secret so that the Midianites don't find him in the land that God had given them. They're hunkered down in secret, threshing their wheat. Why? Because of sin. Because of sin. Because of the failure to separate, because of the failure to impart, because of the failure to learn, there's Gideon hiding and threshing wheat in his own land. But his fear is transformed by God, slowly at first. I want you to look at verse 12. The angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. Now, if I were preaching on Gideon from this text, I would underline that phrase, mighty man of valor, because Gideon is anything but right now. God will turn him into a mighty man of valor, but he's not that yet. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, and then I want you to notice some words, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all His miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Notice, if, why, but. Those are words, that's the vocabulary of fear. That's the vocabulary of doubt. And where did that doubt and fear come from? It came from failure. It didn't come from God. It came from sin. And Gideon is an excellent representation of what the nation of Israel had become. But eventually, he found his faith. And you remember the account of the 300 men that God chose to go with Gideon, and the insurmountable odds that seemed to be standing in the way of Gideon in victory, and yet he prevailed. But I want you to fast forward. Through that period of faith in Gideon's life, and I want you to see where the foundation of failure takes Gideon. In Judges chapter 8, in verse 24, And Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you, that you'd give me every man the earrings of his prey. Verse 25, they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a garment and did cast thereon every man the earrings of his prey. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides ornaments, collars, purple raiment that was on the king of Midian, beside the chains that were about the camels' necks. And Gideon made an ephod thereof, and he put it in his city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel went thither a-whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon to his house. He set up idolatry, essentially. False worship. Where did he get that from? Where did Gideon, this mighty man of valor, learn false worship? From the failures of Israel. Failure to separate. Failure to impart. Failure to learn. And notice how difficult it was for Gideon to abandon that idolatrous way, even after great success. If we lay the foundation of failure, how hard it is to overcome. And we see it in Gideon. Well, let's fast forward and let's look at Samson, this great man of faith. And in Judges chapter 13, you can't get a more spiritual table set for Samson than what his parents do for him. Samson's parents desire greatly Manoah and his wife to have a godly child. In verse 12, Manoah said, now let thy words come to pass. How shall we order the child? This is Judges 13:12. How shall we do unto him? What's the manner of life of this child? Notice they go to God and they say, God, you tell us how to direct this child's steps. How commendable that is. But it takes this long for the wicked society and Samson as a representation of it to rear its ugly head again. Chapter 14 and verse 1. And Samson went down to Timnath, and he saw a woman in Timnath of the daughter of the Philistines. You know those Philistines they failed to utterly drive out? You know those? And he came up and he told his father and his mother, and he said, I've seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her to me for wife. I saw something I wanted. Does that sound like the society in which we live today? You see, Samson was reared and built on that foundation of failure. A failure to separate, a failure to impart, a failure to learn. And as hard as his parents tried, it was so difficult to overcome those influences. You jump forward to chapter 16, then went Samson to Gaza and saw there a harlot and went in unto her. And then in chapter 16 and verse 4, it came to pass afterward that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Samson made horrible decisions relative to who he connected himself with. And we understand that Delilah eventually robbed him of his strength. Samson allowed her to do that. Philistines came upon him and they subdued him. They poked out his eyes. They chained him to the pillars. And in one last valiant effort, he brings the house down around him and destroys those Philistines. Failure. That foundation of failure, failure to separate, failure to impart, failure to learn, crept into the society at large and produced a failure to live and serve God in any semblance of what He directed. One last illustration of that is found near the end of the book. In chapter 17, after Samson, the final judge in the book of Judges, is described. It says in verse 1, there was a man of Mount Ephraim whose name was Micah, and he said unto his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from thee, about which thou cursed, spake of also in mine ears. Behold, the silver is with me, I took it. You think, oh, he came clean, that's great. Maybe Micah's a man of good character. No. He and his mother conspire and they create an idol from those 1,100 shekels of silver. And he sets up one of his sons to be the priest. But then, as fortune would have it, a Levite comes that way. And Micah says, what an opportunity for me to have a man of God, to be a priest in my place of worship. And so he hires that Levite. And I find it very interesting what is said about that Levite. Verse 10, Micah said unto him, Dwell with me, and be unto me a father and a priest, and I'll give thee 10 shekels of silver by the year, and a suit of apparel and thy victuals. So the Levite went in, and verse 11 says, the Levite was content to dwell with the man. Notice the standards of God's priests. Notice the standards of the people. Does that look anything like what God had legislated throughout the first 5 books of the Old Testament? Does that look anything like what Joshua had commanded and charged the nation of Israel to do when they entered the land of promise? It doesn't look anything like it. You know, there's a fight that happens in chapter 18. It's a fight over those same gods that Micah set up and over that same Levite. And I want you to notice what happens. This would be funny if it weren't so sad. Some people from the nation of Dan come through and they threaten Micah and they take his gods. And notice what else they do. Verse 18, and these went into Micah's house and fetched the carved image and the ephod and the teraphim and the molten image. Then said the priest unto them, What do ye? And they said unto him, Hold thy peace, lay thine hand upon thy mouth, and go with us, and be to us a father and a priest. It's better for thee to be a priest unto the house of one man, or to be a priest unto a tribe and a family in Israel. And notice what it says in verse 20, And the priest's heart was glad. And he took the ephod, the teraphim, and the graven image, and he went in the midst of the people. He was content to dwell with the man, chapter 17, and he was glad for a better opportunity. Priests who are willing to sell their soul to the highest bidder. Tribes who are willing to steal the false gods of one man and make them their own. Where is God's standard in the nation of Israel? In one generation. In one generation it left. There arose a generation that knew not God. You know, there's a common refrain in chapters 17 and 18. Look at chapter 17 and verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Chapter 18 and verse 1. In those days there was no king in Israel. Failure to separate. Failure to impart to their children the ways of God. Failure to learn from the lessons that God taught them through captivity and suffering. Failure to live and serve as God would have them to. The book of Judges is a book of failure. And how discouraging it can and probably is for us to look at a book like this and to see the failure that took place among the nation of Israel. A failure to separate, a failure to impart, and a failure to learn leads to a failure to serve God in life and society. And dear friends, that truth is still true today. But what do we do? What do we do about this? As we read the book of Judges, it is certainly an indictment on the way that so many have departed from God. But it can also be seen as a challenge. You see, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way for the nation of Israel. They could have changed. It doesn't have to be this way for us. If we want to avoid the outcomes that are spelled out here in the book of Judges, we must separate ourselves. We must teach God's Word diligently to our children. We must learn from the lessons that God teaches us, so that then we can serve Him and live as He would have us to every day. Separate, impart, and learn so we can serve. You see, we can take the negative lessons we see in the book of Judges and we can transform those into positives in our lives. Maybe tonight. Maybe you're a Christian within the sound of my voice and you look at your life, maybe you look at your family and you say, we have not done these things. We've not separated ourselves from the world as we should. We've not imparted these things to our children and learned them ourselves as we ought. We certainly have not learned from the lessons that God has been trying to teach us through His providence, and we want to start now to change that. Well, it's not too late. It's never too late. As long as you're breathing, as long as we're on this earth, we have opportunity to change. Maybe this evening you're not a Christian. And you look at that cycle of sin and suffering and you say, I want to stop the cycle of sin right now. This evening you can put Christ on. You can change your future. No matter what your past was, you can change your future. If you'll but obey the gospel. If you'll put that old man of sin to death in obedience to God. I hope that we can read the book of Judges and we can see it as a stark warning for what can happen when we don't live as God would have us to live. Shall we pray?